Chapter 17. "Why do I get the feeling I'm late for something?" mumbled Jennifer to herself as she woke up. It was dark in her cell, and she had been chained to the wall. She and Daniel had nearly frozen when a truck came by. She vaguely remembered a sharp prick followed by all of her muscles tightening up, and then everything going black. She looked around slowly. The floor was made of stone. A thin layer of dust had accumulated across its surface. There were thick black iron bars that made one side of her cell completely open without any privacy. The feeling of being watched was unpleasant, and it felt so vivid the sensation seemed tangible. It was almost as though she could feel unfriendly eyes on her. She noticed a metal toilet in the cell and cringed. She looked to the other side and noticed that Daniel Young was next to her, also in chains. "Doctor," she whispered. He stirred slightly but remained asleep. She bit her lower lip and looked around nervously. She wished that Victor were here. Her eyes closed as she imagined his dark hair and piercing eyes. He would have known just what to say. Perhaps she should have insisted that he stayed instead of sending him off to rescue Sig with the others. The sound of footsteps outside the dark cell brought her out of her daydream. She patiently waited as the footsteps approached, hoping that something humane was coming, such as a hot meal, or even better, a privacy stall around the toilet. Of course, she knew it was far more likely to be someone determining their intelligence, to see if a more technical position, such as computer maintenance, medicine, or other service, could be filled. Such skills were valuable to augments that had embedded computers, implants, and other technical needs. Having been nearly sold before, she was familiar with the process. Unfortunately for her, an attractive woman's skills were rarely as valuable as her attractiveness. Even the most pragmatic augments recognized that the monetary value of a beautiful woman outweighed any skills she might have. Jennifer shuddered. The footsteps paused at intervals, followed by the sound of gates sliding open. This individual was coming into several cells. Jennifer sighed as she realized meal delivery was the best explanation for the sounds she was hearing. Her stomach growled. She pressed against her abdomen with her palm to quiet it, but her hunger intensified. Her dreams of moist pasta and creamy sauce with juicy vegetables and meatballs with Victor were likely to be replaced by a tin cup of moist oatmeal with Dr. Young. At last the sound of footsteps were matched with the one making them. Jennifer gasped. A beautiful girl with brown hair walked up to her cell. She had greasy overalls and a tight white tank top underneath, both of which were tight enough to reveal a lovely, slender feminine figure. Her dark skin was smooth, except for the patches of black grease that were obviously from working with machinery. Her brown eyes were large, and her black wavy hair was held out of her face by a black handkerchief tied up behind her head. "Hello there," said Jennifer, hoping to win some sympathy. The woman saw Jennifer's long blonde hair and blue eyes, and her dress. She gave a confused expression, but said nothing as she brought a tin cup filled with oatmeal and set it next to Daniel. "I'm Jennifer," she added with a smile. The woman seemed more confused by her apparent cheerfulness. "What's your name?" asked Jennifer. The woman raised an eyebrow as she went to obtain another tin cup from the cart she had left just outside the cell, but said nothing. Jennifer looked down, hoping she was not making this awkward situation more difficult. The woman finally brought a tin cup filled with oatmeal toward Jennifer. Jennifer smiled and reached up, and their hands touched briefly during the exchange. "Thank you," said Jennifer as her face turned slightly red. She felt like she had made the situation more awkward. To her surprise, the woman tilted her head as if reconsidering her. She looked around, ensuring that no others were immediately present, and then pulled a wrench out of a pocket in her greasy overalls. Jennifer's eyes grew wide, fearing that she was about to be struck with the tool. Instead, the woman began removing the bolts that bound her shackles together. "I appreciate this, but can you also help my friend?" asked Jennifer softly. The woman said nothing as she finished freeing Jennifer. After looking at the crusty old doctor with drool running onto his coat, she shrugged and began freeing him. Daniel stirred. "What? Who?" he said as he sat up and sucked in the saliva that had been oozing down his face. The woman gestured for him to be silent by putting her finger to her lips, but said nothing. He looked at Jennifer and noticed she was free and watching intently, so he decided to remain quiet. After a minute, Daniel was also free. He finally broke his silence. "Do you know where that Kappa 16 to whom we were sold is?" asked Daniel with air quotes. He hated using them, but Lizard was not around to see him. The name Kappa 16 made the woman shudder with fear and look around in paranoia. "We need to find our keys," whispered Jennifer. The woman pointed to the shackles she had helped to dismantle with an expression of confusion. "They are divine keys that grant us special abilities," clarified Jennifer. It was clear that the term divine keys had piqued the interest of their liberator. She covered her mouth as if to prevent herself from making noise, although she had not uttered a sound as far as Jennifer knew. She looked around as if paranoid. She turned back to Jennifer to capture her attention and knelt on the ground. She wrote in the dust with her finger the words, "No games. You have divine keys?" Jennifer and Daniel smiled at her and nodded. She looked at them carefully for several moments, as if trying to determine whether she believed them. Finally, she brushed her words out of the dust and motioned for them to follow her. They remained quiet as they followed her. They moved carefully past the other cells. As Daniel saw the starved prisoners that occupied some of them, he clenched his fists in anger. Jennifer grabbed his arm and shook her head as if to say, "Not now." He frowned, but continued moving. Finally, they came to a section of wall with a small hole. The woman motioned for them to follow and crawled inside. Jennifer and Daniel slowly crawled through the hole and found themselves inside a narrow tunnel. Jennifer closed her eyes to fight the feeling of claustrophobia as she followed their liberator down the passage. She looked up to see a complicated set of belts that carried tin cups. She gasped as she understood the situation. The prisoners in those cells were not fed by their captors, and this woman had tried to save their lives on her own by smuggling food into them using this complicated mechanical setup that maximized the use of the narrow tunnel through which they were rushing. It was not the first augment prison to employ the philosophy that if prisoners are fit, they can survive without help. But it was the first to have someone brave enough and skilled enough to try and help those held captive. Eventually they arrived at the end of the passage. The woman reached up and pushed up the metal grate that formed the ceiling in the end of the tunnel and cautiously looked around. Certain that there were no immediate dangers, she hopped up and then extended her hand to aid Daniel and Jennifer. In a few seconds, they were all out of the tunnel and in a large hall. Following the woman's lead, Jennifer and Daniel walked casually ahead and looked around. The walls and floor of the hall were made of the same metal grate. The air was much warmer and more humid in this hall. Jennifer found it refreshing, but Daniel began to sweat uncomfortably. After a few minutes, they followed the woman through a metal door into a huge dome that was filled with rows of tall plants. Daniel immediately recognized this as a plantation. The area into which they had entered appeared to be dedicated to corn, and the tall plants provided the illusion of privacy. The sound of voices caused the woman to freeze. She motioned for Jennifer and Daniel to be still. They followed suit as the woman cautiously peered into the next row of corn. She put her hand over her mouth to see an elderly woman with pale skin that seemed to cling to her bones, surrounded by 4 augments that had humming stunners in place of left hands. "Your productivity is inefficient," one of them barked at her cruelly. "Please, I just need additional time," begged the woman in a tired voice. "I will gather my quota." "We believe you have been consuming food," accused another of the guards. Daniel's eyes narrowed, and he clenched his teeth in anger. Jennifer put her hand on his shoulder to silently advise caution, but she felt anger as well. This woman did not look like she had consumed food at all for weeks. The accusation was outrageous. "No," said the woman resolutely, "I would not do that. It is not mine." "That's right," said another guard. "It's not yours." He immediately began zapping her. The other guards joined in as she slumped to the ground, trembling. Daniel shook Jennifer's hand from his shoulder and leapt through the corn. Their liberator's eyes grew wide with terror, but she did not move. "I will not tolerate your barbarism a moment longer," shouted Daniel, with indignation fueling every word. The guards spun around to face Daniel and laughed when they saw the crusty old doctor that had confronted them. Jennifer turned to the woman that had saved them and smiled. "You may stay hidden if you wish, but I think I'll join him. I was a slave once too," she whispered. The woman's eyes grew wide with a mixture of concern and admiration. Jennifer rushed through the crops and tackled one of the guards that had been preoccupied with Daniel. In the confusion, Daniel grabbed the arm of one of the guards and jammed it into the body of another, stunning him unconscious. "Jennifer!" shouted Daniel. She ducked, narrowly avoiding a lunge from the fourth guard, then pulled the stunner from the guard she had tackled straight up, zapping her attacker. Daniel took a kick from the guard with whom he was grappling and stumbled to his back. Jennifer leapt up and grabbed the throat of the guard that had attacked Daniel. The guard pried her off his neck just as Daniel punched him in the face and knocked him back. Jennifer lunged at the back of the guard's knees, causing him to fall to the ground. Daniel kicked him in the head, knocking him unconscious. Daniel began smashing the stunner hand off of the guard. "Are you all right?" asked Daniel as he rushed toward the old woman that had been attacked. Jennifer walked up next to him as the final guard that she had originally tackled got back to his feet. He began rushing toward her. She spun around and gasped, realizing that she would not be able to evade his attack. To her surprise, Jennifer saw the woman that had freed them rushing in and slamming her wrench against the head of the guard, knocking him out. Jennifer and the woman looked at each other while breathing heavily from the stress of their rebellion, and after a moment smiled, realizing they were successful. Their moment of happiness was ruined as Daniel slammed his hand against the ground in anger. "She's dead," he said angrily. He stood up slowly as he continued. "But we will give her life purpose. When Sig and the others get here, and they will get here, we will put an end to this savagery." Jennifer and the woman looked at one another resolutely. Neither of them had intended to start a rebellion when the day began, and though they said nothing to one another, they both knew that they were determined to win it. The woman knelt in the soft, moist earth and wrote, "Stephanie Mason," and then pointed to herself. Jennifer smiled. "Nice to meet you, Stephanie," said Jennifer. She smiled back and then brushed her name out of the dirt and motioned for them to follow her again. "Wait," said Daniel. He rushed to the unconscious bodies of one of the guards and twisted the stunner attachment off of his arm. "This might come in handy," he declared. Stephanie motioned for the doctor to hurry. "Hang on, I'm not as quick as I used to be," he said. Soon they were rushing between lines of crops again. It was only a few more minutes before they ran into another guard on patrol. Stephanie stopped Jennifer and Daniel before they were spotted and looked around for an alternate route. Jennifer rushed out before Stephanie could stop her. "Jennifer," whispered Daniel angrily. He turned to Stephanie. "That girl is far too casual with her life." Stephanie turned toward Jennifer and narrowed her eyes, as if to agree with Daniel's assessment. It did not take long for the guard to jog toward Jennifer. She stumbled and fell on the ground as if she were intoxicated. "Oh, hello," she said to the guard in slurred speech. "Do I know you?" "Why are you not laboring?" asked the guard as he fired up his stun arm. "Is that the right question?" asked Jennifer. "Maybe I should ask, why are you laboring?" Jennifer burst out laughing as she slowly got to her feet. Daniel rushed up and zapped the augment in the back, knocking him unconscious. Jennifer pulled off his stun attachment and smiled. "You're right," said Jennifer. "These will probably come in handy." Stephanie rushed down the line of crops as she looked around. Jennifer and Daniel rushed after her. Eventually they arrived at another metal grate, which Stephanie pried up. Jennifer sighed in exhaustion as she looked to see another narrow tunnel through which Stephanie intended them to travel. It was clear that this tunnel was not used for transporting food. There were nails up above from which dozens of different tools were hung. Most of the tools were clearly handmade, using wires and bits of wood, rock, and metal. Others were probably stolen and were more clearly formed. There were a number of mallets and wrenches, pliers and snips. While narrow, this tunnel was not straight. It seemed to wind back and forth for some distance. The air cooled off as they traveled, indicating they were moving further from the climate-controlled area and closer to the outside. Jennifer shivered as she hurried to keep up with Stephanie. Daniel did not seem to be affected by the cold, but he breathed heavily as he hurried to keep up. Stephanie shot looks of disapproval back toward him a few times, undoubtedly frustrated with the noise he was making. Daniel did not seem to notice this either. Finally, Stephanie stopped near a metal grate in the wall. She spun around and put her finger to her lips. Daniel finally acknowledged the noise he was making with his heavy breathing and made an effort to control it. After a short time, Stephanie pushed the grate out and snuck out into a new chamber. The air here was much colder, and goosebumps began to appear on Stephanie's arms. Jennifer shivered as she watched her breath become visible again. As they snuck out, they noticed that the room was filled with storage containers. The cool temperatures in this area were ideal for food preservation, and not generally harmful to other items that might need storage. The containers varied in size from small boxes the size of a fist to large vats the size of 30 people. Shelves consisting of the light metal grate through which they had come supported these containers and reached 50 feet high in the warehouse chamber. Stephanie looked around carefully as she led the way. Jennifer and Daniel kept their stunners ready in case they were ambushed or they needed to ambush. Shafts of light illuminated the concrete floor in regular intervals, and it seemed to Jennifer almost as though they were glowing columns supporting the domed ceiling that wrapped over the section of the farming compound through which they slowly crept. As they circled around the outside, they eventually came to a section that was blocked off by chain-link fencing. There was a pair of augment guards with stun hand attachments that stood on either side of the opening. Their dark uniforms were adorned with the Greek letter Kappa on an insignia that was shaped like an eye. Jennifer had not paid attention to this detail before, and wondered if it might be a clue as to how the master of this plantation had been augmented. She decided that for someone who prides themselves on their eyes, they had actually gotten quite far without being noticed. She concluded that it was more likely a representation of a past master that had been replaced. Stephanie motioned for Daniel and Jennifer to stay down. She slowly walked toward the guards with her head lowered. "Hey," said one of the guards with a sneer. "It's that mute girl." Stephanie approached the guards cautiously. "You know, mute," said the other to Stephanie, "since you can't scream, no one would hear if we had a little fun with you." Stephanie's eyes grew wide with discomfort, and she instinctively crossed her arms over her chest as though to diminish her figure. Jennifer shook her head in anger from the shadows. One of the guards walked slowly behind her as the other stepped up to her and began running his fingers across her face. "Yeah," agreed the guard that was touching her face. "And since so few people come into acquisitions, no one would hear if we had a lot of fun with you." He grabbed her arms. She twisted around to escape his grip, but the other guard pulled her arms up by the elbows and held them up. Jennifer rushed up and yanked the head of the guard behind Stephanie back and lunged with her stunner, knocking out the guard that had faced her. The guard on the floor rolled over and jumped up. "A blonde?" he said. "Even better." Daniel rushed to try and get to him, but before he could make it, Stephanie spun around and punched him in the face, and then kneed him in the groin. Daniel winced as he watched the burly man drop to his knees helplessly. Stephanie grabbed the hair of the guard and slammed his nose into her rising knee, knocking him out cold. She stood still for a moment as her shoulders rose and fell in sync with her breathing. "Are you all right, my dear?" asked Daniel softly. She nodded and turned around toward the entrance of the fenced area. There were a number of long lockers that appeared to be made of steel. Each of them had a combination lock keeping it closed. "Which one?" asked Jennifer as she walked between the aisles of lockers. Stephanie tilted her head in thought as she examined the lockers. At last she chose one. "Are you sure?" asked Jennifer. Stephanie put a finger to her lips, indicating she wanted quiet. She leaned close to the lock and began twisting the dial carefully. After listening for a few moments, she began twisting the dial the opposite direction. She frowned and began twisting again. Daniel and Jennifer looked at one another nervously. Neither one of them wanted to repeat this lengthy task for each locker in the room. Stephanie shook her head in frustration again and started over. Daniel began walking through the other aisles softly, looking for clues as to which lockers might have been used recently. Jennifer stayed and watched as Stephanie patiently listened and twisted the combination knob. After a few more minutes, Stephanie pulled the lock and it opened. Jennifer gasped in amazement. Daniel rushed back around. The locker door seemed to move open slowly as they gathered to see what was inside. As the ambient light shined into the locker, they saw only the empty bottom. Jennifer looked nervously at Stephanie as she pointed to another locker. Daniel returned to another aisle in his search for clues. Stephanie listened carefully to the dial again as she twisted it. Carefully, she began twisting it the opposite direction. Jennifer took a deep breath as Stephanie twisted. She pulled, but the lock remained fastened on the locker. Stephanie pulled a lock of dark hair behind her ear as she reached into her pocket. Suddenly, she remembered the wrench that she had used to free Jennifer and Daniel, and smiled. Daniel rushed back around when he heard the loud crashing to see what the matter was. Stephanie smiled as she removed the broken lock from the locker and opened it up. Inside the locker sat a familiar pair of mirrored keys attached to chains. Jennifer smiled and put hers around her neck. Her eyes glowed briefly as the key touched her chest. Daniel's key glowed as he picked it up and fastened it around his neck. Stephanie looked with wide eyes at them, since she had never seen anything like the reaction that came from a divine key being claimed by its guardian. The moment of victory seemed to disappear almost immediately as a loud explosion echoed from the wall outside the fenced lockers. Jennifer, Daniel, and Stephanie rushed back behind some of the lockers to take cover before they attempted to discover the cause of the explosion. Jennifer shivered as cold air from the outside rushed in. "So where are they?" came a voice from the explosion. Jennifer and Stephanie strained to see the person to whom it belonged. "I don't know, it's like they just disappeared," came a higher-toned reply. "Sig!" shouted Daniel. Jennifer and Stephanie whirled around in surprise at Daniel. "Doctor?" shouted the first voice. "I guess we know why they disappeared," said the second voice. Jennifer finally adjusted, realizing that Sig and Lucas had breached the wall. Lucas's abilities had probably led him to the location of Daniel's key. She rushed out, hoping to see Victor. "Jennifer!" shouted Sig with a wide smile. She was happy that they had rescued Sig, but even more happy to see that Victor was with them in his long dark coat. "Hello," she said excitedly. Daniel and Stephanie stepped up next to her. Stephanie caught sight of Jonathan in his long white cloak with a pair of crossed swords stowed on his back and a mirrored key dangling from his neck. Her pupils dilated and the corners of her lips turned up involuntarily as she saw who she determined to be the most regal-looking man she had ever seen. Sig's voice interrupted her focus. "New friend?" asked Sig happily. Daniel nodded as he cleared his throat. "Yes," he said. "We need proper introductions. Everyone, this is Stephanie Mason, who was previously a slave in this compound." Daniel's statement surprised Stephanie to the point she nearly corrected him to indicate that she was still a slave. As she thought about it, she decided that he was right. It seemed as good a time as any to call herself free, particularly since she had met genuine bearers of divine keys. The tales that had captured her imagination suddenly had become more than bedtime stories. They were real. She could hardly wait to prove herself to her mother and friends. "Stephanie," continued Daniel, "you've obviously already met Jennifer Cedar. She does not remember exactly where she came from, but we're glad to have her anyway." Jennifer was displeased with the introduction she received, but quickly put it out of her mind as Daniel moved on to Victor. "This is Victor Lee," said Daniel. "He is also relatively new to our group, but he is perhaps the most well-rounded member." "Hello, Stephanie," said Victor. Stephanie smiled. She could tell why Jennifer seemed to be so short of breath around Victor, but in Stephanie's view, he was not as attractive as Jonathan. "This is Kirana Sepharvaim," said Daniel. "She's a sniper and a sword fighter, with a heart as cold as ice." Stephanie was confused at Daniel's harsh introduction, but Kirana seemed apathetic toward it. "Doctor," reprimanded Jonathan, "aren't you supposed to do no harm?" Stephanie smiled at the sound of his voice. She was also impressed that he seemed anxious to defend others. Daniel pointed at Jonathan as he continued. "And this is Jonathan Knight, who aspires to be her boyfriend." The smile melted off of Stephanie's face as she looked back at the doctor in shock. She quickly turned back to Jonathan to see if his face might confirm Daniel's statement. His reddening cheeks gave away that he did have feelings for Kirana. Stephanie turned toward Kirana and noticed her apathetic expression. Stephanie tried to appear equally apathetic, but she decided immediately that she did not like Kirana. "This is Ulysses Carter," said Daniel as he pointed to Lizard. "Everyone calls him Lizard, though, because he scurries around as quick as a lizard." "As opposed to Daniel," said Lizard with a smile. "He's as slow as a snail," he said with air quotes. "Lizard," said Daniel in an irritated tone. "Quit using those infernal air quotes." Stephanie smiled. "This is Sig West," said Daniel in a softer tone. "He's the big guy." "Hello," said Sig with a wide smile. Stephanie was impressed with his size, and she decided that Daniel had labeled him correctly. He was extremely tall and his arms were thick with muscle. It was a stark contrast to the slaves that she regularly saw in the compound. "This is Lucas Flynn," said Daniel. "Don't let his youth fool you. He is possibly the smartest person I have ever met." "Thanks, Doc," said Lucas with a smile. Stephanie wondered if Daniel was just being kind to someone so young. She smiled courteously, though. "And I am Dr. Daniel Young," continued Daniel. "He's the one that gives long speeches," said Lizard with air quotes. "You would do well to listen to more of them, Lizard," said Daniel angrily. Stephanie paused, wondering if she was about to witness some kind of altercation. Lizard just laughed. As Victor and Sig smiled, she realized that this banter was probably typical. "So what can you tell us about this compound, Stephanie?" asked Lucas. She shook her head. "She's unable to speak," explained Daniel. "Can you write?" asked Lucas as he reached into his pack. Stephanie nodded as Lucas pulled out a pad of paper and a pencil and handed them to her. She smiled and began scribbling a diagram. Lucas waited patiently for a couple minutes as she furiously drew on the top sheet of paper. "We've got to help these people, Sig," said Daniel passionately as Stephanie worked. "They stunned an old woman to death. They left prisoners to die. They don't understand how important life is. They don't know its purpose." "Calm down, Doctor," said Sig with a smile. "You had me convinced at 'we've got to help.'" Daniel smiled. He had always been able to depend on Sig. There was never any hesitation with him, even from the moment when he had first approached Sig and asked for help in locating the divine keys. He had jumped on board immediately. "Thank you, Sig," said Daniel softly. After a few moments, she ripped the top sheet of paper off the pad and handed it to Lucas. He smiled as soon as he saw the detailed drawing that showed the position of the connected buildings that made up the plantation. It was clearly and concisely labeled. "This is fantastic," said Lucas. "Thank you." Stephanie scribbled a note on the pad and handed it to Lucas. "Mind if I keep the pad and pencil?" read Lucas. "Of course not. They belong to you now." Stephanie smiled and stuffed the small pad and pencil into a zip pocket on the bib of her overalls. She was obviously excited at the prospect of being able to communicate better. "What do we have, Lucas?" asked Sig eagerly. "It looks like there are a number of domes that are connected, forming a nested pair of rings. There's also a dome in the center, from which the master of the plantation, Kappa 16, keeps surveillance on everything." "Surveillance?" said Kirana with a frown. "We blasted a hole in the wall and walked in, and we've been waiting for a few minutes. What is he, asleep?" As if to answer Kirana's question, a truck engine roared outside, followed by the metallic bouncing of grenades. "Take cover!" shouted Victor as he pulled Jennifer down and hovered over her protectively. "Gas!" shouted Jonathan as his eyes began glowing. "Run!" Lucas darted away into the aisles of containers. Lizard grabbed Daniel and scurried after them. Sig grabbed Stephanie's hand and pulled her into a different aisle. Jennifer and Victor rushed into a third aisle. Kirana and Jonathan rushed back only to avoid the gas, but then drew their swords. Though none of them knew it, Kappa 16 had made arrangements to deal with the intrusion. He had purchased the services of a uniquely qualified consultant to deliver the 9 of them to him. The sound they heard next drowned out the roar of the engine and the footsteps of dozens of guards in gas masks rushing in, or the shouting that echoed off the lockers and shelves of the storage bins. It was the blood-chilling shriek of Row 82.